Recording in progress.
Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar. My name is Donna Chow, and I am your host and your moderator for today's eLotus webinar. eLotus is the leading provider for continuing education for acupuncturists, and today's webinar is Healing the Earth, 5 Element Archetypes and 5 Spirits Acupuncture, presented by David Hartman. This is the 6th of a 7-course series in which David has been giving weekly webinars on the 5 Element Archetypes and the 5 Spirits. To get the full benefits of the complete series, register for his upcoming webinar or purchase the past webinars on video at a later time. Both options do come with CEUs, or even better, I recommend the Gold Pass membership. This allows you to see all of them for free, as well as receive unlimited CEUs and free herbs. All right, guys. So before we begin, let me do a little housekeeping here. Today's webinar will be from 2 to 5 p.m. Pacific time, and we will have one break. If you have not done so already, please get your copy of the lecture notes from the Blue Course Access page in your account. If you want to join the chat, please do the following right now. Set your chat preference to everyone so that everyone can see what you're typing. You'll have to do this manually because the default setting allows only the speaker and staff to see what you're writing. If you have any questions during the presentation, please type them into the question box in your Zoom control panel. If there is time during the presentation, David will answer them. The quiz and video replay will both be available tomorrow afternoon, and you will receive an email notification when they are. We'll go ahead and get started today with an introduction and welcome David Hartman, a licensed Chinese medicine practitioner from Brisbane, Australia, who has been in practice since 1997. David is well known for his signature acupuncture point combinations, on which he has authored a textbook. David has given presentations at conferences and seminars all around the world. He's always researching and learning new things in the field of Chinese medicine and has a wealth of experience in the field. It is an honor and privilege to have him with us today. Without further ado, David, please go ahead and take over by sharing your screen.
Donna, thank you, eLotus. Hope you can all hear me fine, see me fine. Thank you. Thank you for coming along again today. Yeah, it's interesting. I saw a couple of comments in the chat that this is the last one. This is not the last one. It's the last one in terms of going through each of the 5 archetypes. And then the one next week is a 4-hour workshop rather than 3. And it will kind of compare and contrast the 5 against each other. But yes, in terms of the archetype systems, for those that have been at all of them or plan to go back and look at them again, this is our 5th of 5. So I thought I'd give a quick example of what was most likely an Earth archetype. What's the word I'm looking for? A goodwill gesture is something that Earth archetypes are really good at. And one of the things that we might not think about in terms of the archetypes is that they actually can continue to be offering up what their inherent or guardian archetype is even after they die. So the clinical example that I have that maybe people haven't thought about very much is, so just a quick bit of backstory. So obviously for those that have been attending these most of the weeks, in late March I got COVID. But what I don't think I've mentioned is that in early March, I injured my knee really badly playing touch footy. And on Friday this week, I go in for a knee reconstruction. And So basically, I ruptured my anterior cruciate ligament and did some damage to other bits and pieces in my knee. Obviously, I'm kind of one of those people that doesn't do things in halves. If I'm gonna go at something, I'm gonna go at it hard. If I'm gonna injure myself, I'm gonna injure myself hard. And anyway, we'll have a bit more of a chat about this next Wednesday when you see me post-op. But the Earth archetype thing I'm getting at is that I'm getting a donor tendon. So I'm assuming, and it makes sense in terms of Earth archetypes, that this person that has died, that's donating their organs and their anything that still works, are donating me one of their ligaments or one of their tendons. And I'm very grateful for them, but it is an interesting little story. I guess we don't think about it. It's like, oh, okay. Even after they die, they're still an Earth archetype because they're still giving, they're still looking after people. So bless them. I just hope it's not an 80-year-old's tendon when I'm only 48. But anyway, I get what I get, I guess, and I won't complain. So yes, we're going to do the Ye Earth today. We start as per usual with the workshops with the archetype, and then we have a break, and then we do the spirit of that associated archetype after the break. Again, goal is always to have time for questions at the end, and again, hopefully that will be the case today. So, as usual, I start off with a quote. So, I think if it is true that there are as many minds as there are heads, then there are as many kinds of love as there are hearts. And I think that that's a perfect little quote for Earth archetypes, and even to a lesser extent, fire archetypes. You'll notice over this next 3 hours just how giving an Earth archetype is, and whether they're using their Yi or whether they're just inherently using all of their 5 spirits, because effectively that's what they should be doing. They're just that type of person. And I think that some of us sitting here today, including me, and even though I'm a fire archetype, there's still a part of me that would be quite happy to be an Earth archetype as my guardian or primary. There's a lot of beautiful things that an Earth archetype brings to the community and brings to individual people. They're not perfect and they have flaws just like every other archetype. Inherently, what they offer the world really interests me in terms of they really do care. And that, for me, is something that I really strive to do myself, even within my fire archetype. That's a driving force for me. And it'll be interesting to see who thinks that they are the Earth archetype at the end of this workshop. So as you can see, what we've been going through, obviously, is the first one was the overview, and then we went through Shén fire first. As some of you were aware of, because you've watched it, that was the design, because if you start with Shén, it's a little bit of, it's what makes up all of the 5 spirits. So start there, and then I work my way through. And as I said, Earth today, and then the combination of them next week. Talked about this slide already. And there's a little bit of stuff at the start, which I do apologize for all those that come each week. It's just for the new people in case you aren't aware of some of the inner workings of each of the workshops. So, and this will be done a little bit more next week. But basically, just because you're an Earth archetype doesn't mean you're automatically going to have your Yi. So this is the line of balance, and we picture all 5 of the spirits sitting at that line of balance, hovering a bit above, a bit below at any given point. Just because you might be a dominant Earth archetype doesn't automatically mean that the Yi will be sitting up there in that more dominant role, or I guess even we might even consider that being a bit more excessive. It an earth archetype should have the most balanced yi because of that close connection. So we don't want to get confused with the fact that an overriding dominant archetype doesn't automatically mean a dominant spirit. The spirit will be appropriate and it will be appropriately responsive. Yeah, that's good. Appropriately responsive. So at times it'll charge into excess when we really need it to take charge and be dominant over the others. And at other times it will become quite submissive and pull back and withdrawn when we need maybe new ideas to come to our forefront, in which case our hun will dominate. So then the hun will drive up into excess, even though we're an earth archetype. We'll come up with new ideas, new ways of doing something. Then the hun will come down into the body, and then the yi and the ji and the Shén will take charge of that dream. So then the hun takes a back seat. And then if the dream is in our truth, which we'll talk about a bit later, it will drive down into our po, and that will take charge. So that's how the 5 spirits should work in the body, ideally. So you do tend to diagnose the archetype and the spirit individually, pay attention to each of them. Now, a lot of you are putting into the chat where you're from, and I appreciate that. If you've not done that as yet, love to see where you're from, please. So you just stick where you're from in the chat. Phoenix, Arizona. I know about that city because I've got a band I like called Bless the Fall, who are from Phoenix, Arizona. They're a bit heavy, but very good. I love hearing where people are from and whether I'm going to be in your area at any given point as well. And if I'm not sure where some place is, I like to get on the map and have a look and see where that is. Thank you for sharing. Lots of Californians. I guess that makes sense to E-Lotus being in the California area. Thank you. And the next question, which some of you are already on top of, which we'll get to in just a second. I live in Brisbane, Australia, as most of you know. And do you do local and or distal needling? If you could put that in your chat, please. Both. Wow, lots of boths. I noticed last week when we were talking about whether you do unilateral or bilateral, that was very similar in terms of probably a 40% split, and the other 20% was both bilateral or unilateral, depending on what's needed. Seems to be a lot more local and distal. So both in the chat. I asked this again because it wasn't something I really thought too much about until so I started studying in 1993, finished school 91, yep, 93. And all this time, I really am fascinated by the way that people treat. And for whatever reason, I never really looked too closely at whether people did local and distal needling. I think for me, I guess I just thought that people probably did the same as me. And maybe about 5 to 7 years ago, time goes so fast, maybe 7, 8 years ago, the Dr. Tan and Master Tung sort of started to insert itself into the Australian acupuncture community. And for the first time, I became more aware of people that liked to do that more distal needling approach and not necessarily local. I mean, I know that all of you are probably very aware that we don't always do local because sometimes we can't get to it. Certainly for me, after Friday, no one's going to be doing any local needling on my left knee for a number of weeks. but I can do my right knee and I can do my right and left elbows as mirror images, and I can do above and below the knee, although I am in a splint for a couple of weeks apparently, so I'll be restricted on what I can get to. But that's a good example of how just logistically, I just can't get to the area. And even if I could, would I do that immediately anyway? This is what you weigh up. Local needling you might not do after someone's had, say, heart surgery, because they don't want you to touch their chest ever again. And so you need to figure out ways around that. And we know that there's enough distal points to treat that local area anyway. I'm just a very big fan of putting some in that local area, some in that distal area. The local stuff works on that issue directly and encourages toxic stuff out of the area and encourages good stuff, like good chi, good blood, good body fluids, good jing into the area to heal. And then the distal ones send the good stuff to the local area and drag the toxic stuff out. So in some ways, having both the local and distal, in my brain, just makes sense, because you're working at the issue in multiple ways, creating more of a dynamic effect. But there's no discounting the fact that just distal needling across whatever system you like and you've learned, there's certainly a lot to be said for the value at which they can get results, or that you can get results. So thank you for sharing. Today, obviously, Earth Archetype, the Saviour, is probably my favourite title for it, and we'll go into that in more detail shortly. Now, back in workshop 1, we had 130 people. Today, it looks like we've got about 150. So at the end of this particular workshop, we'll ask you if you think you are Earth. You'll see, just as a guide, in workshop 1, we had about 27% of people that thought they were Earth. Bearing in mind, of course, back in workshop 1, a lot of you didn't know the full scope of each of the archetypes. And so this hopefully will be a much better representation of each person's archetype. So we've gone through each of them. And then in workshop 7, so the next one next week, I will be doing some tables that map out all of the workshops through from 1 to 7 and the participant numbers and the percentages, so that we get an overview of all of them. And we'll look at the mixed and unsure in the next workshop as well, for those of you that still think you're in that slot. Again, APCs mean acupuncture point combination, point prescription treatment. You will see them written up in tables, so that there's that nice little structure for you to get a better sense of where everything sits. Basically, the point combinations come not just from me. They're not just exclusively mine. They come from a mix of places, either other people's textbooks or a group of textbooks. It might be that Giovanni Machachia has offered up a couple of really interesting points, and then I mirror that in with, say, some points from Hicks and Mole, or I love Peter Dedman's Manual of Acupuncture, and it's really helpful in terms of understanding what each point does. So often merge treatments or add in points from Dedman et al. Workshops, if I get some really good points and I try them out, same at conferences. And obviously Chinese medicine peers are important as well. Through that process, these workshops get built, and then the textbooks that I've written get built. So some of the point combinations come from there. The 30 years of clinical experience should never be discounted. Even if you've got 2 to 3 years of clinical experience, don't discount that, because every single person that you treat has made you challenge yourself, made you a better acupuncturist, presumably. And so every time you treat someone, there's that chance that you've improved on your skill set and become a better acupuncturist as a result. It always matters to me that you understand any Western medicine term by defining it in your own brain and then looking at how that would fit in Chinese medicine. I recognize the value of the mix of the two. I remember one of the first things I was told back in 1993, it was just about the first class I had, and I was told in no uncertain terms, you must never merge Western and Chinese medicine thinking, that they needed to always remain split. And at the time I went, okay, I'll take that on. I don't know if I'll agree with it, but I'll take it on. And throughout the 3.5 years of my full-time study, I processed that statement and I came to the conclusion that I didn't agree. And that I think that you need to understand these different types of medicines. We live in a Western society, most of us, and so to take our medicine and get a better sense of it through Western terminology, we're not making Chinese medicine or our studies Western. We're just getting a better sense of how each one plays off one another. And for me, that I consider that to be very important. And then, of course, based on whether you do local or distal points, whether you do bilateral, unilateral needling, the number of needles that you use, each point combination will be unique to you. So you'll take the slides that have the point combinations and you'll decide whether you want to edit it or keep it as is. The heart, Shén, pericardium are obviously very important, and there's lots of point combinations with heart and pericardium points. And if you needed to know more about each of those, then the Shén Fire workshop is the one you need to read a bit more on. And this is earth and yi, so there'll be a lot of spleen and stomach points this workshop. Whereas in previous workshops, you had different organs and channels that you focused on. So we're into the earth element archetype. So this quote from Muhammad Ali says, "Service to others is the rent you pay for your room here on earth." And I saw this, I was watching a TV show, and it was what came up at the end of the show as a little quote before the credits came up. And I went, my goodness, how perfect is that? I rewound it, went back, paused it, took a photo of it, and it has become part of these slides. That was probably a couple of months ago that I was watching this TV show, and I was planning out this whole series of the 7 workshops for Elotus and Donna, and I saw it there. I just went, stop, and found it, went back, got it. It's just perfect. Service to others is the rent you pay for your room here on earth. He's nailed it. That's just earth archetype. Tick the box. We're done. There's your 3 hours sorted right there. Thank you, sir. So perhaps that's not quite enough. Sorry, Mohammed. We'll move on to a bit more detail. The structure's the same for each archetype, as you've probably become used to. For those that are at the first one of these, the structure will be going through what they're known as, or what an earth archetype's known as. It's yin and yang partners, emotions, and 5 spirits, and then going through each of them, each part of the archetype in more detail: characteristics, loves, fears, difficulties. We look at what the archetype is represented by through an excess, and then we look at a treatment, the deficiency, treatment, or you aren't sure how excess or how deficient they are, or you just want to do a bit more of a balancing treatment, well, then we've got one of those too. And then, of course, how to communicate to an earth archetype patient or an earth archetype person that you know or see. Of course, point combinations are included. They're the usual references that I've been using throughout this whole workshop series. Sometimes I use different books, but they're the main ones that I've been using. So an earth archetype, which in the Beanfield and Korngold textbook, they referred to the earth archetype as being the peacemaker. The peacemaker embodies sympathy and caring, a ready advocate for those in greatest need of friendship, sustenance, and recognition. Negotiating peace for its own sake, she tirelessly serves humanity as the great balancer and equalizer, the preserver of families and societies. Again, pretty hard to find a much better quote to sum up what an earth archetype is. Negotiating peace for its own sake. An earth archetype can't not help others. It's just ingrained in them. There's no more important feature, no bigger driving force in their life than to help people, one person at a time, to get to the point where the world is saved. And that's their inherent driving force, their goal in life. Which is why earth archetypes gravitate towards healing types of medicines, like Chinese medicine. And that's why there's never been a workshop that I've done on the archetype systems, whether it be online or live, where there's ever been more archetypes than earth. I've been close. I don't know if I've mentioned that in this workshop series or not. When I was in Rothenburg at the Congress over there, about 6 or 7 years ago, I did this 5 element archetypes. And at the end, we put everyone into different sections of the room, like I do. And there were nearly as many metal as there were earth. And then not many wood, fire, water. And that's never happened before, and it's never happened since. And I think it's got partly to do with the fact that in Germany, you actually learn Western medicine. You become a GP, a general practitioner, a doctor, and then you add on acupuncture, or you become more like what we'd call in the West a naturopath. I can't remember the term they use in Germany, but so you're a naturopath that learns acupuncture, or you're a doctor that then learns acupuncture. So you can imagine the stereotype of that. You've got the doctors learning acupuncture, they're going to be more the metal, and you've got the naturopath acupuncturists that are going to be more that earth. There's always exceptions to that rule, but that's the way I kind of looked at it. And interestingly, last week, we had a lot more water archetypes than I've seen before, and we mused about that as well. This is an online workshop, so water archetypes can sit in their safe place and not have to venture out into the world, because they can just watch it on their computer at home or in their safe place. But I'd still be surprised if earth is not the highest at the end of this workshop. If I was doing a workshop, if I was doing this 5 element archetype workshop for other careers, then different archetypes would be the dominant archetype. But because we're in that healing medicine modality type of thing, the earth archetypes will gravitate towards that more than all of the other archetypes. They're also known, apart from savior, negotiator, mediator, peacemaker, diplomat, caregiver, caretaker, intermediary. So again, if any of those words resonate with you, then there's a chance that you are an earth archetype. The yin and yang organs of the earth archetype are spleen and stomach. And for whatever reason, the Yellow Emperor Classic, this one's the Su Wen, they didn't split spleen and stomach up into individual organ sections like they did with most of the other organs. And the quote is that the spleen and stomach and spleen are like warehouses where one stores all of the food and essences. They digest, absorb, and extract the food and nutrients. Now, when we think about Chinese medicine, we think about, I don't know what you think about. And this is where it's so hard when I'm staring into a screen and we're not getting that, I guess, chance to discuss stuff in person. But a lot of us probably look at Chinese medicine as being, like I said, incorporating the Western component to it, modernizing it, looking at clinical trials and research and getting that sort of proof that Chinese medicine is working for various disorders. I would imagine that a percentage of us quite like looking at the classics and pre-modern texts and using those ideas to enhance our skill set. I think that when we look at Chinese medicine, if we look at modern China now, it would be a mistake to assume that that's what it was like when those original textbooks were written on Chinese medicine, because the ones that were released to begin with were released in the Han Dynasty. And the Han Dynasty, give or take, had about 400 years of peace. So I always talk about this idea that their weapon of choice was the pen, as opposed to a sword or a bow and arrow or whatever it's. So during that time of peace, they had a lot of opportunity to really nut out their medicine and look at their history and decide how the medicine was going to look. And as some of you know, the medicine was built around this idea that each organ was an official of something. So each organ was considered important to perform a certain role in society. And that predates the medicine really back into philosophies that were abundant through the Warring States period. The Warring States period was about 300 years of civil war in China, sort of roughly 500 BC to 200 BC. And again, a lot of people don't know about the Warring States period, yet it was 300 years of civil war, yet everyone on the planet pretty much knows about the American Civil War that didn't even last 2 years. My understanding, about 2 years. So it's extraordinary to think that we're missing such an important part of Chinese history and how the philosophies were designed around the war they were in, which ultimately creates the medicine. And so what they did was they took the philosophical ideas of each organ being an official of something, which meant that each organ was equally important apart from the emperor. So they acknowledged that there was one emperor. The emperor was on the throne thanks to heavenly mandate, Tianming, which meant that they were the best person to be on the throne because the heavens suggested that they were going to be the best person, and of which is the heart organ. And then every other organ weren't devalued in terms of what they gave society. And that's important, I think, for people to recognize that they said, okay, the spleen and stomach, they're partly, initially they go back to being farmers and producing the best quality crops so that their immediate family is nourished and harmonized and healthy. But of course, the state took a percentage of the crop to take back to the warehouses in the cities in order to nourish the wider population. And so you had to value the farmers because they were so important for the role that they provided the Chinese society. In the same way that the army general was important to protect the state, and so on and so forth. And so we don't want to devalue any organ. We recognize the heart's the emperor, but all the other organs have basically kind of equal value in terms of their role in society. At any given point, one of them might step forward and take charge because of the importance at which they need to do that, and the others might pull back a bit, and then vice versa, others come in and take charge. And that's the floating nature of what Chinese medicine and philosophy is. And so we don't want to discount any organ for the sake of another. They're all equally important. In terms of the Earth archetype emotions and 5 spirit, the main emotions associated with the Earth archetype are pensiveness, sympathy, and worry. There are other emotions that do pop in from time to time. Depression can play a part, grief can play a part, so can a bunch of others, but the main ones that we look at typically are those. And then the Yi, which we'll talk about in more detail, is not just those 4: thought, post-heaven intellect, intent, and memory. I'll be discussing 13 different headings, of which we'll look into it in much more detail. And if any of those don't make any sense, like what post-heaven intellect is, we'll look at that as well. Earth archetypes learn to ask for help when they need it and to take in nurturing and care offered by others. They are also able to give support and nourishment to others and to distinguish between when it is appropriate to look after their own needs and when to care for the needs of other people. Interesting statement, because the second an Earth archetype falls off any form of balance, they stop looking after themselves as much as they look after others. It doesn't matter whether we're excess or deficient, that's just what happens. Now, the mechanics of that change, and we'll look at what happens when you're excess or deficient soon, but the actual fact of the matter is that that's what happens. And all of a sudden, they start looking after other people more than they look after themselves. And then that creates an imbalance, a disharmony. And then they'll stop asking for help from others. And they'll even start to get that little thought in their brain that they don't want to burden someone. They don't want to put someone else out. They're much more interested in helping others than to trouble other people to help them. And so they put themselves second, they put themselves third, fourth, fifth, and that creates an imbalance, both in their society and in their immediate environment, but also within themselves. And that is obviously not a good thing. But when they're balanced, that statement is very accurate. So the characteristics of an Earth archetype, so much good stuff here. They're a negotiator or peacemaker. They're sociable. They're sympathetic, considerate, attentive. They're very good at that. They're not like in your face attentive. They're not overwhelming. They don't get up in your personal space. They actually know the appropriate distance to sit or stand from you based on what archetype you are. So if you're metal or water, they know that if they're just a little bit further away, not so much in your personal space, that's a good appropriate distance. Whereas if you're more a fire or an earth archetype person that they're talking to, you can get up in their personal space a little bit more and would, depends on what's going on in their world at that point in time. But they know the distance and they're very attentive. They don't look distracted. It's an amazing skill to have. They're very loyal. They have a very focused intent, and that's that attentive nature of things. They're really paying attention to you, not in a creepy way, as I said, appropriate distance, just in a loving, caring way. Earth archetypes, when they're on song, you'll tell them the world. It's just like you feel like they're your best mate, even if you only met them 5 minutes ago at a party, because they just understand who you are very quickly. It's like an earth archetype can show up at a gathering, at a gatho, as my girls will say. I show up at the gatho and they look at everyone that's in their field of vision and they identify every other person's archetype really fast. And I'll talk about why that is shortly, but it's basically because an earth archetype is a bit of all the 5. So they recognize, oh, that's a little bit me. Straight away, even just looking at where people are standing, who they're with, the volume of the group, who's taking charge, who isn't, They will work out what everyone is. And so straight away, they will recognize what your archetype is probably. And if they don't, they'll have a series of questions that they have intuitively, instinctually, that they will ask you early on in the conversation to work out what you are. And even if an earth archetype doesn't know they're an earth archetype, doesn't know anything about 5 element archetypes, anything about any archetype, they're that type of person and they just do it anyway. So, and then when they've got that focus point with you, that you're their whole world, and they don't look distracted, they don't look away, they focus and concentrate on you. It's a beautiful thing. A stable, poised, composed, moderate, very nurturing and supportive, agreeable, self-aware, and very good constructive thinkers. They're not going to tell you what to do if you're spilling your problems to them, because that's not the way it should be done. The way it should be done is that the conversation is angled in a way that they ask a series of questions to you to help guide you to come to your own conclusions, which creates a ton more power, because at the end of the conversation, you walk away and go, wow, that person really gets me. And I can't believe how good that conversation was. It was so constructive in terms of helping me work out where I want to go next. So the conversation in your own mind gets spun in a way that you add the value to the conversation by honoring your part in it. If I say to you, stop smoking, are you going to stop smoking? It's unlikely. It doesn't even matter if I'm a really important person to you. You stop smoking because you want to. So there's no value in me saying, just stop smoking, you dickhead. I mean, it's just not, it's counterproductive. You might smoke more because I spoke to you that way. Sorry for swearing. Or you might go, oh yeah, David's got a point, but you know, it's, you know, and they still don't. What's good about an earth archetype is they never do that. They don't point, they don't swear, they're not rude, they don't say do this, do that. They guide you in a way that at the end of the conversation, you recognize the true worth of you and you go in and tackle it. And that creates a lot more standing power, because you have decided on it as opposed to someone else telling you to do it. And you're much more likely then to do it. And then you're accountable to it too, which holds more power again. You're much more likely to keep up with the willpower to follow through to the end when it's you that's thought it. The earth archetype has a lot of intelligence, just like all the other archetypes do. They use more the post-heaven intellect. A lot of the senses are being activated all the time for them. We'll talk about that more in detail a bit later, but it's knowledge you learn via the senses. So they're spotting what's going on through the use of their senses. Exceptional memory, quick learners. They remember things with minimal study, good concentration. They're the person that you might be walking through the supermarket and you're at one end of the aisle and an earth archetype's at the other end of the aisle, and you start walking towards them. If they're an earth archetype, they already know who you are, what your name is, what your husband or wife's name is, all your kids' names, what you do for a living, what your hobbies are, what TV shows you like, music, taste, everything. The minute they see you, the post-heaven intellect kicks in and they go, right, that's David, blah, 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 blah. I'm David at the other end of the aisle and I'm a fire archetype, and I look up and I go, that person looks vaguely familiar. Can I remember their name? Oh. And so I'm walking towards them and my brain's trying to memory recall, who is this person? They look so familiar. That's what my brain's doing. Meanwhile, they've already worked everything out. again, it's just an incredible skill. In the past, when I was really embarrassed about that, I would actually, like, this is, decades ago, I would actually look down and away and hope they don't engage in conversation with me. Nowadays, I just go, hey, how's it going? Look, I'm sorry, I've forgotten your name. I'm just honest about it. And, once I've got the name, then usually it'll kick in, or an earth archetype will go, oh, hey, I'm Bill. I met you at the barbecue last week. Oh, right. And then it clicks in. They're very helpful like that. And they probably worked out that I don't really know what their name is or where I saw them from, because again, they just worked that out. But that's how good they are. When they're balanced, it's just like, it just never goes away. It's an incredible memory and ability to engage in society. And that skill is so important for them to keep, because it helps everyone feel more comfortable at ease. I get that might be uncomfortable for some people, because in that situation, in a one-on-one, it can feel a little bit confronting, but they'll quickly make you feel at ease, or they'll recognize that you do not want to talk to them, and so they won't. Or they'll just say, hey, and keep walking. They reflect on past events, successes and failures, and they learn from them. There's nothing wrong with going back into the past to learn from mistakes and to fortify yourself of the things you did well. That's what the value of the past is, to learn from something so you don't do it again if it's bad, and to pat yourself on the back and go, oh, that's right, I did that. Yep, good on you, mate. You learn from it. It's all those sorts of things. So going back into the past at the relevant times is appropriate. Just checking my schedule here. When Earth is your primary archetype, its kindness directs the way you interact with your environment. You share the gifts of empathy, unity, commitment, and devotion with the world. So in terms of that term, the empath, there's more Earth archetypes that would be an empath than any of the other archetypes. Other archetypes can be empaths, and other archetype systems have empath as being potentially any of the 5 element archetypes, because let's say numerology, for example, which I will talk about numerology in the coming months. Blessed, Donna and Elotus, they've agreed to let me do some workshops online and live on numerology and tying it in with the 5 element archetypes. So in the numerology archetype system, your date of birth, you put all of those numbers into a chart, which I'll show you how to do if you are attending that workshop. And basically where the numbers sit on the chart, you look for where there is no numbers in a line, or whether the numbers in a line actually make a full line. So you've ended up with no numbers, which is considered they talk about as being a negative arrow, or if you've got all numbers, it's a positive arrow. We'll go into detail on that in more at another time. But anyway, if you've got one particular arrow in your chart, it's called the arrow of hypersensitivity. And that arrow is also an empath, but which I have. So even though I'm a fire archetype, I have characteristics of an empath in me because I have this arrow of hypersensitivity. The hypersensitive nature of it is your energies are more sensitive to your greater environment. So I pick up on stuff that's external and it impacts me. As a result, I don't watch news anymore because it's too sad. But I use my empath stuff in different ways. So that's a different archetype system that talks about empaths using a different mechanic. In terms of the 5 element archetypes, as I stated, the earth archetypes are more likely to be an empath than any of the other archetypes. What do earth archetypes love? They love unification, harmony, serenity, security. Predictability is good. Can get a bit boring, but predictability is reliable for them, and they like that reliability as well. They're good with details. They love comfort. This has been mentioned before, basically the two most social archetypes are fire and earth. The most sociable, the most that want to go out into the world. If you say you have to go away for work, for argument's sake, for a few days, an earth and a fire archetype are more likely to engage in the people around them, even if they're complete strangers, whereas metal and water are more inclined to maybe just get a good book and go down to the restaurant and have their meal in quiet, read the book, and then go back to their room. For me, if I go anywhere overseas or locally, and I know nobody, I'm social. I go down and I engage in conversation with complete strangers, which some people think is really weird, but that's just my nature. I'm interested in people and I want to know more about people. And I've just had a fascinating life because of that, but everyone is different. Earth archetypes feeling needed is important to them, and family, those beautiful, close-knit friendships and family and connections, very important, which it's ideal if that's stable. They love sharing, huge sharers, in fact, possibly oversharing. In fact, if they're even remotely out of balance, they overshare. They like being involved in everything, and they also like being the negotiator, during which they need to be the go-to person. So if they're in a group of 4 or 5 people and they're chatting and they feel like they could step in and help a situation, then that's when they would like to be the one that does that and not have other people kind of jumping in and talking over the top or stealing their thunder, or however you want to term it. They feel like they're the best person for the job, and so they would like to be the person that does it. So earth archetypes are very good at recognizing if they can be the negotiator. If there's 2 earth archetypes in the one conversation, if they're both balanced, probably one of them will either step back and let the other take charge and stay in the conversation, or politely leave the conversation and go and find another conversation where they can be the negotiator. Or they'll step out of a conversation if, say, wood and fire archetypes are being too loud and too dominant, and they know they can't help. They might also either step into the background or they'll leave the conversation and go and find a better one for them. They like being well organized and living in the now. The present moment for them is key, and it's something that they resonate so well with, that what matters is right now and how they can help the world become a better place now. And of course, each archetype's a little bit different. We've done them all so far, so you're getting a sense of that. Earth is the energy of letting others go first and stepping aside to make room so everyone can fit into the circle of conversation. As the glue in friendships, I like that. As the glue in friendships, very important. That's a big thing for Earth. As the glue in friendships, primary Earths are exhilarated by the idea of caring for you. Pleasing you is deeply satisfying and inculcates, if that's even how you say that word, instills. Pleasing you is deeply satisfying and instills Earth types with a profound sense of self-worth. They help others, it props them up. That's what happens. I had to look up what that word meant. Inculcates, instills. So they help other people, it helps them feel better. Now, let's look at some stuff that they can start to exhibit if they're starting to fall off balance. They fear conflicting roles, loyalties, frames of reference, or value systems. Any of those types of things can create a problem for them in terms of how they can work around that in order to help themselves and to help others. So obstruction, stagnation, sluggishness are issues. They don't like other people being disloyal because they would never be. Treachery, unfaithful, untrustworthy, all these things are deeply disrespectful and disturbing, and something that they find incredibly off-putting, and they wonder why anyone would be like that. And then this term of a snake in the grass. And so that's essentially, you're probably aware, but maybe you're not, someone is stabbing you from the back. So they're coming up behind you and stabbing you in the back. An earth archetype doesn't want that. What they want is for you to stab them from the front, because if you do that, as they're coming towards you, they can work out what archetype you are, what they're feeling, how they're acting, and they have the best chance to try to stop that happening. Because all of a sudden they know, oh, right, now how do I need to take this conversation? And so they would prefer that you come at them from the front. There's this song from a British band I really like called Bring Me the Horizon. And one of the songs they have out is, the words are, true friends stab you in the front. And I guess as disturbing as that is, that's kind of the reality of what an earth archetype would want. And again, if you're just going to stab them in the back, they've got no chance of trying to help you, help them, because they still want to help that person. Why did they do that? You know, this sort of thing afterwards, they'd be like, why did that person do that? If they come at them from the front, they're a better chance of negotiating and working out what's going on. They fear change. They fear conflict in general. These are all things, now that you know a bit about the earth archetype, these are all making sense to you, I'm sure. They fear feeling lost, isolated, separated, displaced, or independent of their wider community. The community is what makes their world. So they fear being independent of that. They fear insecurity. Self-doubt's a big one for them, because what happens is when they fall off a balance point, that incredible memory and intellect starts to fall away, and then they start to doubt themselves because they're becoming a bit more forgetful, or any range of other things. Or they feel a little bit more, their self-worth can drop. And so that can also feed into, am I really most worthy of helping this person? And so this inner conflict starts to take over, and they start to have self-esteem issues. They fear that things are not going according to plan. They do like a bit of a plan. Pretty adaptable though, and not feeling valued for their negotiation skills. It's a funny one. Earth archetypes like to be thanked, and you can verbally say it, but the non-verbals they'll get to, and the non-verbals will prop them up just as much as the thank yous will. If they fall off balance, they will either want you to thank them all the time, or they will not want you to thank them at all. So we'll talk about that more, but they'll do things like, oh, don't mention it. And they put the wall up, like, I don't want to hear it. And oddly, they say this, but then down in their body, they really did want the thank you, but they say it enough, people stop thanking them. Don't mention it. Don't mention it. It's all good. What do you do after a while? You hear that enough, that physical and non-verbal information, you probably stop doing it because they're telling you. Patients with a healthy earth element can easily give and receive emotional support and nurturing. The health of a person's earth element is largely dependent on the quality of the relationship with the mother. Thought that was interesting. Personally, I don't entirely agree with that. Certainly that last sentence. An earth archetype is the one that's almost the equal amounts of the yin to the yang. So in some regards, the father is very important there as well. And I guess it just comes down to the nurturing that they're given through those mother-father relationships. Or maybe I'm just reading the sentence wrong. I would like to think that my children considered that, regardless of what archetype they are, that they're being nurtured equally by me and their mum. Earth archetype difficulties. This interesting quote from Beanfield and Korngold again. Earth archetypes may be so concerned with establishing balance and harmony that the dynamic tension essential for movement and change is neutralized. I find that an interesting one. We have to be very careful as an earth archetype that you don't try to over-control something, or you try to play catch up because you've lost control. A good, healthy earth archetype just rolls with however the situation unfolds. Very adaptable. They have difficulties, can have difficulties with interfering and meddling where they're not wanted or not needed. And that feeds into the next one, manipulating situations to make them fit what they believe is best for everyone. What would they know? How can they know with absolute certainty what is right? So I think that's probably pretty obvious, but obviously sometimes what's happening is that they think that they would be really beneficial in a situation, so they insert themselves into that, and it turns out that they're not wanted or not needed, but then they stay in it anyway. And feeding into the next comment, they might even try to make it change into what they think is best, which goes away from being the person that asks questions of you so you come to your own conclusions. They start to tell you what to do. Now, what do you know? How do you know that what you're telling them to do is in their best interest? You can't, with 100% absolute certainty, know if it's the right call. And so it's best to not force issues in that situation. And that's the ironic thing. Ironic? It's like, this is what happened with Socrates. Like my understanding of him is he never told anyone what to do. He always asked questions in order for the person to come to their own conclusions. He never discounted the god structure in ancient Greece, which was lots of different gods for lots of different roles. He was simply someone that was just interested in the wider community and how to help people one person at a time, in terms of helping them look at what their belief systems were and see whether it could be, altered. Instead of coming to this conclusion that when you're 20 years old, that all of these things mean this, and stay in a box and never think of any other way to look at something. That's, what do you get out of that, really? So he looked at social structures and really fascinating stuff, and would never have ever tried to tell people what to do. It just wasn't inherently in his nature. Yet he ended up in court and stood trial and was told by order of the court that he had to commit suicide because he was adversely manipulating and injuring the young Greek people. So basically, he was forced to commit suicide for the thing that he was the least like. So again, I don't know if that's irony or whether that's a different word, but anyway, he took it in good grace, bless him. Although I guess it's perfectly okay to kick and scream to death as well, if that's the way you want to go. So what else does an earth archetype have difficulties with? Self-sacrifice? Yes. Pleasing others, being everything to everyone. An earth archetype that falls off balance will often try to please everyone, and then they end up pleasing no one. So they want to go to 5 parties on the one night, or they want to help 8 people at once. They're running around town, they're exhausted, and they're really, in the end, not spending the time they need individually to help each of these people. Unrealistic expectation of another person's behavior and or how the world should operate. That's a good one. Feeling extreme disappointment if people fall behind the lofty standards they set. So again, on balance, when they're balanced, they're less like that. When they fall off balance, they really start to become quite self-critical and also critical of the wider community as well. Melancholy and independence, we've talked about already, really. Even though Earth dole out lots of compassion to others, many of them have a hard time feeling compassion for themselves. They can become stubborn about not needing help. If they ask for help, they feel they're putting someone out or being a burden. Their mission is to help others, not the other way around, so they often suspend their own needs and desires. Earths often feel deep down that giving to another is more important than being nurtured themselves. And this is what we've just spent, the last hour kind of breaking down. Now, for me, that's an earth archetype falling off that balance point, even a little bit. Because when an earth is balanced, they recognize when it's time to step back from helping others and to help themselves. It's when they fall off the balance point that this statement here, this beautiful few sentences, really does jump in. And everyone in this workshop right now know of someone like this, or it's you. Now, in good news, Chinese medicine actually can do something about that. So what happens if an earth archetype goes into excess? Well, they're overprotective, overcrowding, overbearing, meddlesome. They take unnecessary risks. And that memory, that incredible memory, starting to fall away. They can't learn things, new things, and they can't retain the information they already have, and they get quite scattered. And so the thought processing can be scattered, or they become pensive, so plunged in thinking. And they spend all this time thinking, and not doing, or being. Very obsessive, overextends, overreaches. They've got plenty of energy. That's correct and incorrect. They have plenty of energy, but they will fatigue. Their brain fatigues, their body fatigues. It's just in the excess, they rapidly go back into the energy state again, whereas the deficiencies, they never feel like they really have any energy. They can worry so much about the future that they become obsessed with it. Therefore, they live in the future. They live in the present moment. They live in the past, but their primary focus is more what's coming up. The bad stuff that's coming up and not wanting to deal with it. The good stuff that's coming up, can't wait to get in it. And then they get in that thing they wanted to get into, and then they start thinking about the next thing they want to get into. And boom, they're through it too quick. And they're like, oh, I was looking forward to that for so long, and then bang, it was gone. That type of language. But they'll still spend time in the present moment and still spend time in the past, because even though they're earth excess, they still have periods where they're balanced and deficient. It's just the overriding nature of it is that they're more excess. They can, even though they're excess, still reject other people's sympathy and empathy and all those types of things. And they throw up a mask of self-love, but it's a sell. They're selling to the world that they're okay because they don't want people to check if they're okay or to try to help them feel better. They don't want any of that. So they sell to the world that they're fine, or even sell to the world that they're a step further and almost a bit narcissistic, just so people won't come at them and just leave them alone. And then they can just continue to be overprotective, overcrowding, overbearing on everyone else. And they excessively worry about everyone and everything. And they can become obsessed, cling or attach themselves towards a particular person to the point of displaying psychotic behavior. So this is kind of individually targeted psychosis, as opposed to, I guess, that awful one where, you know, someone takes a gun to school and kills as many people as they can, where that's a non-targeted aggression, where everyone is against them. This is psychotic behavior where particular people or a particular person are against them. And because they have an excess nature, they are very dangerous people, or they have the potential to be very dangerous. Now, when you look at all of the other statements on this table, most of those are pretty harmless, really, in terms of hurting other people physically. It can hurt other people mentally and hurts themselves. So that last one is really when they're falling off their balance point. They are extremely excess and they've moved way beyond normal or hovering a bit above and below it. So that's someone that you're not going to really see all that often, because people don't get that excess all that often. And hopefully, before they got to that point, they actually recognized they needed help and reached out. Although, as you can see, a lot of those things in the table suggest that they won't do that, but the design is that they will. So what can we do? So we've got 16 needles. We've got some points on the head, face, or neck. In this case, it's on the top of the head. We've got a point on the front of the trunk, a couple of points on the back, and then some points on the legs and the feet. So when we look at it, we want stomach ache because it will drive the excess out of the head, drive the excess out of that Shén, and drive the excess out of the Yi, so they think more clearly, and everything sits more in that moderated space. The best earth element kidney spirit gate point is kidney 23. The back shoes of spleen and stomach, I think, would be appropriate here. We're looking at orrery points there. The on the clock points is what orrery means, of the clock or on the clock. They're referring to that 2 hours of every day where the energy of the body is in each organ. So they talk about this idea that if you do acupuncture points of that element in that time, you're getting a trifecta of energy, a triumvirate of energy. So if we look at spleen 3, for example, and stomach 36, they're earth points on earth channels. And if you did them between 9 and 11 in the morning, excuse me, 7 to 11 in the morning, you actually are in earth time. So earth point, earth channel, earth time, triple earth. But if you did the earth of earth points outside of that 7 to 11 a.m., it's still double earth, and they are regulating points, balancing points. So spleen 3, stomach 36 balance out the disharmonies associated with the earth element and the earth archetype and the Yi spirit. In the same way that the wood of wood points, fire of fire, metal of metal, water of water do the same thing for their associated archetype, their organs and their spirits. And then because they're excess, we do 5 element theory, where we choose the child point on the Shang or generating cycle, in which case that's spleen 5 and stomach 45. 16 needles all up. So for me, that's about the maximum number of needles I would personally use. The needles are sensibly scattered. I'm probably not personally going to do a front and a back treatment in the same treatment. So I'd probably choose a face up or face down, and then I would just either not add any extra points or add in a few extra ones to balance it out. That's my personal sort of look at it. But these are not point combinations that are exclusively my design. If they were, you would rarely ever see a front and a back needle in the same treatment. So I'm giving you what you see consistently in the literature and what you hear. So if this works for you, great. Get into it. If you would make some changes like I probably would, then make those changes. If you use more than 16 needles, what are you going to add in? Is it going to help the overall treatment? If you use less, what are you taking out? Is that going to help the overall treatment? The Earth archetype can assume and enhance the attributes of those around her, putting people at ease in an environment of trust. Beautiful. If they're deficient, unmotivated, stuck, can't be bothered all too hard, you become very conforming, sloppy, horrible memory. Too tired to study, can't learn anyway, can't concentrate in order to learn, retain information, you're vague, and you will procrastinate. You'll procrastinate in the excess too, probably. And we talk about procrastination more when we get to Yi. It's quite interesting. So you'll do anything except the task that you are charged to do. Quite melancholic because everything was better in the past. Lethargic, tired, sleep all the time, just exhausted. You reflect excessively on the past, therefore you live in the past. If a time machine existed, in theory, you'd be the first one to buy one. In practical terms, apart from the fact that there is no such thing, you're probably too tired to get out of bed to go to the store to buy the time machine, and then to go to all the effort of working out how to operate the time machine, because that means you've got to read the instructions. And then if you finally do go back into the past, you're too tired to really benefit from it anyway. It's a whole thing. So in their mind, they'd be the first one to buy the time machine, is probably the reality of it. They crave sympathy from others, may manufacture signs and symptoms, even diseases, in order to receive more sympathy. Interesting. These patients are incredibly difficult to treat because they need their disease. There's this joke I say about people like this where you meet this person for the first time, and typically what happens is, what do you do when you meet someone for the first time? You say, hey, how's it going? My name's David. What's your name? Probably pre-COVID, you shake their hand, that sort of thing. This type of person is literally, you go, hey, I'm David, and they go, hey, I'm insomnia, or hey, I'm high blood pressure, or hey, I'm arthritis. It's like they're so keen to tell you what's wrong with them that their disease has almost become their name. Because what's most likely to happen next, if you say, hey, I'm David, and they say, oh, hey, I'm Sandra, I'm probably going to say, how are you? Oh, well, David, let me tell you, my arthritis has been playing up. I got this wicked headache and I forgot to pack my Panadol and blah-de-blah-de blah. And I'm not an earth archetype, I'm the fire archetype. So I just trod in it. And so I'm looking for an escape. I'm scanning the rest of the room. I'm going, how can I bail out of this conversation? Because if I don't know them and I know what's just happened, I'm ready to bail. And I'm sorry if that's disrespectful or rude or inconsiderate. But the reality is I don't, in that situation, necessarily want to solve all their problems for them. And I recognize that they don't want to solve their own problems either. They just want to tell you about their problems. And you know what? I'm 48. I recognize that enough now Why am I wasting my time? Again, apologies if that's rude and disrespectful and inconsiderate, but that's just the way that I recognize it. I could spend all the time in the world with them, and in the end, it's unlikely to make any difference. So be very wary of people like this in terms of your ability to heal them, because if they need their disease, you can't heal them. Deficiencies, poor self-esteem with a real shame for self cycle, depression, grief, sadness, worry, fear. They excessively worry about everyone and everything and can become obsessed again towards a particular person. They can have psychotic behavior, but they've got no energy. So it's highly unlikely that anything happens. It'll be more musings and desires and more passive types of movements. And again, it's unlikely they'll be this. They'd have to be severely deficient or Earth archetype excess with deficiency, which is possible. Deficiency treatment, got 16 needles again. This time we've got do 20. Great point to drag the energy up into the head. Vital for this particular person for obvious reasons. The Earth element kidney spirit gate point is good again because it works on whatever's wrong with the Earth element archetype. This time I've chosen front moo points, liver 13, ren 12. I could do back shoe points. You could swing them around and do back shoe points for deficiencies and front moo points for excesses. In my opinion, I consider front moo, back shoe, yuan source as being treating whatever's wrong with the organ and its associated archetype. I'll leave lung 9 for a minute. We still have the orrery points because they do anything wrong with the earth. And this time we want mother points on the Shén cycle, which is the preceding point on the Shén cycle. So that would be spleen 2 and stomach 41. And then lung 9 is the earth point, and this is an earth imbalance, and it's on the Tai yin partner of the spleen. So the spleen is yin, and it has a yin partner, which is the lungs. So it's an earth point on its Tai yin partner. So there'll be a good little connection there. I tell people that no matter whether an organ is yin or yang, it always has a yin and a yang partner, which is wordy and confusing, but is the reality. So no matter whether an organ is yin or yang, it has a yin and a yang partner. Physically, earth types take steps to maintain healthy digestion and good eating habits. Mentally, earth types remain present in conversation with others, sharing and striving to build rapport and create bonds. That one there. Earth types remain present in conversation with others. Very important for what earth is like. Spiritually, earth types embody and impart the gift of compassion, even in the most challenging situations when others around them choose a less tolerant stance. Just gave a perfect example of that. I'm walking away from that person in that example I gave a couple of minutes ago. An earth archetype in its balance point will be highly unlikely to do so. What about regulating? So I've got a few of the points from the last couple. Earth element, kidney spirit gate point, the orrery points, front moo, back shoes. We've got all those points designed around balancing everything out. And it's balancing out as well because we've got sensible scattering of needles, lots of connections. Hence the combination. And basically what you do is if you decide to start with regulating, you look at what happens, or you start with an excess. Look at what happens the next time they come in. Deficiency, same thing. Adjust, as you would know, adjust your treatments accordingly. If everything should stay the same in terms of your treatment, then do an identical treatment the next time. You're always potentially adapting based on the next visit. How have they changed? What do we do next? That type of thing. If you want everyone to be happy and you truly feel that love makes the world go round, you may be an Earth. Do you want to please others? Do you feel the need to make sure everyone is comfortable and comforted? Do you take time to connect with people and hear their stories and problems, even if it takes you away from your own work and projects? Are you a friend until the end who believes in forgiveness and making peace? If you're reading this, softly smiling and gently nodding your head, then you are most likely an Earth. How will you communicate with an Earth patient? Show a real focused intent during the treatment. They are your entire world for the time you have with them. So recognize, try to understand what's going on there. Don't look distracted. You know, even if this is not your normal port of call, if you recognize your patient as being Earth, this is what they want to see from you. If you've got to fake it till you make it, well, they'll recognize that too, but they'll see an inherent desire for you to fake it till you make it, and they'll respect that. At least that's better that you're trying to understand them and help them than to not care less. Don't look distracted or disinterested. Don't yawn. Sometimes we can't help it. And don't appear vague or uncommitted. Don't get up and answer the clinic phone if it rings. Other archetypes won't care as much. If you get up and answer the phone while I'm your patient, I don't care. It doesn't bother me. Unless you do it 1,000 times, then it does. But an Earth archetype, they just feel like you really are disconnecting and then reconnecting and disconnecting, and that you really don't understand them and what their needs are. Talk about the treatment and how it will provide harmony and balance, the language they like to hear. Make them feel comfortable, feel comforted, feel needed, that you care, that they came to you for treatment. When of course you care. There's certain ways that we come across sometimes where it might look like we don't. Understand that they're also extremely intelligent, so don't treat them like kids. And then that type of language would feed into how you communicate with any person like that out in the world. Again, an Earth archetype would rather you be honest with them if you're walking down a supermarket aisle and you, like the example I gave about half an hour ago, where I'll just go, oh, look, I'm sorry, I've forgotten your name, or where do I know you from? And again, they recognize that that's hard for you to say, and they respect you more for that. And you're not lying to them, which they'll also respect you for. And so that communication works better. And that's part of how, again, you communicate with them, unless you do know who they are, in which case, you know, if you've got a few minutes, spend a few minutes communicating with them. Would that I could be the peacemaker in your soul, that I might turn the discord and the rivalry of your elements into oneness and melody. Brilliant statement. It is taken out of context because it's a section of a paragraph, where he is kind of referring to other things. But when I saw it, I just went, yeah, that fits, by taking it out of its context because it puts it into this context. Would that I could be the peacemaker in your soul, that I might turn the discord and the rivalry of your elements into oneness and melody. How perfect a statement for an Earth archetype. So let's play the Am I an Earth archetype game before we have our break. So how it works, in case you don't know, basically speaking, if you think that you are an Earth archetype as your primary or guardian archetype above all the others, in the chat right now, you need to say Earth, please. 100% Earth. 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Earth, finally. 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. You want to be Earth. 15, 16, 17. Still fire, I know, I'm still fire. 17, 18, not primary. 19, 20, 21. Used to be. Interesting. 22. Earth-ish. That's not a lot of commitment there. But yes, no, I get it. 3, 24. 25. No. 26. 26. Was not more than 26. Some of you are kind of like putting in 2. 26. I'm going to give you a little bit longer. Anyone else? Yeah. Probably 27 will count it. And then I probably missed a couple, so we'll just round that up to about 30. And some of you put in 2. 30. 30 out of 165. This is going to be the lowest ever. Not that anything's good or bad. %. Okay, so we might actually have had the first time this has ever happened, but we'll do it again next week. I think water was 19% last week. I've got earth at 18 point something percent. Interesting. So basically what we're looking at there is, again, over this next week, we'll discuss it again late, just before we finish up. But we're looking at you seeing which one you think is primary, which one you think is, or guardian, which one you think is secondary, which they call support act. And then you look at, if you want to, ranking the other 3. So some archetype, some 5-element archetype textbooks and things don't often get you to rank them in full order. They basically just want you to find the primary or guardian. Some books and literature will get you to look at what your second one is. And that's usually it. It's kind of good to see where you are in all 5. So if you go back through, if you have the capacity to go back through the slides and videos, or if you don't need to because you already know, and rank all 5. And then you'll have your guardian, which will be, say, 60 to 80% of what's written. You'll have your support act, which will be 40 to 60% roughly. And then you'll be anything up to 40% for the remaining 3. And usually if you've got one that's not very charged, it might only be down to around 10, 20% of what you read. So for me, fire is the guardian, water is support, earth is 3rd, metal is 4th, and wood is my least in terms of ranking them. So in theory, some of those deficient ones or weaker ones, I can actively look to try to bring up a little bit more. And some of the ones that are really dominant, if they're too dominant, potentially look to sort of regulate that a bit more. All right. We'll leave the questions till later. So we will have a break for 10 minutes. What is it for you in LA? 3:33. So let's look at coming back in 10 minutes at 3:43 or whatever your time zone says. So 10 minutes from now, if it's 33 past, come back at 43 or whatever your time zone is. We'll see you in 10 minutes. Thank you.